This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 14, The Player as Ego. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're continuing our sort of phase of this season where we're talking about game design philosophy as it comes to tabletop and stuff like that. And I think that this will be an interesting talk, especially on that sort of philosophical side, or maybe psychological today. This relates very closely to our last episode in a certain way, where we were talking about player versus character and the separation thereof. But then, you and I were talking a little while back, and this idea struck me that the relationship between the player and the character might be a little bit more kind of complex if we actually think about it a certain way. And I had this thought that, if you kind of look at the old Freudian psychological model of the mind, which is id, ego, and superego, which we'll explain here in just a minute. And it's, it's one of those like sort of things that maybe since then it's been, refuted a little bit. So it's maybe not like high end, like, this is the state of the art in psychology, but still makes for an interesting model because people still sort of talk in these ways about stuff.
How does that make you feel?
Exactly.
Does that remind you of your mother?
And so I just kind of had this interesting thought about maybe using this model to talk a bit about the relationship between player and character in role-playing games.
Sounds like an interesting thesis. I look forward to hearing this.
And I'm gonna preface this by saying that this is not a thoroughly researched and well thought out thesis. This is more kind of like the beginning of a thought process that could turn into something interesting. But
so like most master's thesis, in other words. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
But I'm not trying to get a degree off of this.
Oh, well, that's probably a good idea.
I already have my MFA, so
yeah, there you go.
I'm good. But to set this up a little bit, the idea behind ego, id, superego is that the id is kind of the subconscious part of your mind, and not like, any physical sense. It's more just like the way that thought works.
Okay.
And personality. The psyche is the term that technically we're talking about. And id is kind of your instincts. It's kind of your animal self in a sense. It's kind of like what your body and your survival instincts kind of desire. So it's like the more, to maybe use a term that's not quite right, kind of your more like basal instincts.
Like primal,
yeah.
Yeah. Your lizard brain.
And then the superego is kind of equal and opposite of that. And now this one can actually be subconscious and conscious. And this is basically stuff that you've been taught by society. It's the stuff that kind of has this ideal that wants you to live up to it, to kind of overcome these more basal desires that the id is kind of getting you to do. If you can almost think of it in a sense as kind of like the angel and devil on your shoulder, except Freud was not fond of supernatural stuff. So
right.
You probably wouldn't appreciate the comparison of the angel and the devil on the shoulder, but nevertheless, it's a good sort of metaphor to kind of get this idea across. Yeah. And then in between those is the ego. And the ego is kind of the part of your psyche that is mediating between the two. That understands that sometimes idealism is, idealistic in the more negative sense, which is to say it's unrealistic. It's not always possible, or maybe it's actually not the best thing in this case. And then, but also realizing that sometimes your more basal desires, you shouldn't just give in to those all the time. They're trying to, satisfy certain needs to survive. Mm-hmm. I need to eat. Or sometimes aggression actually is important for winning a fight in self-defense or something like that, or protecting someone or something like that.
So I shouldn't be playing like 20 hours of World of Warcraft all day long, every day.
Yeah, but your id is telling you need more Warcraft, and your ego is maybe telling you, well, I need to pay for rent.
I need to pay the dog. No, feed the dog.
Pay the dog.
Pay the dog and feed the rent. Wait, right.
What? And so, the ego is kind of mediating between these things and helping you to decide. And, sometimes your personal morality can play into that, which sometimes you might argue that your morality is based largely on the superego, perhaps. But where I'm kind of going with all this is the idea that your character that you're playing in a role-playing game has kind of unlimited potential as far as how you decide you want to play them. And the more you understand about your character and kind of, I like to compare it a lot to writing. Some people might compare it to acting. Understanding your character and their motivations and their background and all this different stuff to inform kind of how they think and how they might act. Some people don't put nearly that much thought into their background, but I think to some extent, we always have some sense of who our character is. And I would call that, in a way, the id of that character.
Almost every character creation process starts with a character concept, that phrase, character concept. And I would say probably like 80 to 90% of the character sheets out there have character concept somewhere on the sheet, that either as like a line at the very top or something. So yeah, I think this is so far so good. Keep going.
And I think also that there's also an implied commonality in all characters that we can kind of shortcut over and we just sort of take for granted, even with non-human characters, where basically every story we tell is a human story. Even if we're talking about anthropomorphic rabbits, as in the Warren, we can kind of relate all of their basic needs to all of our basic needs because it's about survival and it's about, family or food or whatever else.
I feel like I should argue against that, but I can't. Or just because the storyteller is human, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I won't go into at the moment kind of the idea of, like some deeper mythological studies and personification as a concept, and personification being our human tendency to attach human thought process to even natural inanimate phenomena.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so everybody pause the podcast right now and just go read all of Joseph Campbell, come back, and then we'll keep going. Okay, yes. Play.
So I think that fundamentally every story we're going to tell is a human story in that sense.
Yeah.
And so we can relate all of our unconscious or basic desires and needs into any character's basic desires and needs implicitly. We don't even have to state that survival is important to this character. The only time we might call that out is if for some reason survival actually isn't important to this character. And then why is that? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So calling out the exceptions rather than the givens. Now, the superego, on the other hand, might be, I think it's actually kind of two different things, because when we talk about the player as ego, we're also kind of getting into that weird sort of ethereal, I don't even know if that's the right word for it, that weird space between fiction and nonfiction and what's real and what's imagined, and this sort of shared imagined space that is this, like, it's really weird if you actually think about it too much in roleplay.
That's very true. Yeah. Because I might be imagining, let's say we're, I don't know, breaking into a castle or something. It's a World War II game or something. And you're imagining a completely different castle than me. And sometimes this can get into problems. You think you're up on a parapet, and I don't think you're on the parapet, and the GM thinks you're on the drawbridge, and it's like, wait, that doesn't, okay. And then it's kind of up to the GM to resolve that. A really phenomenal stage setter is going to have resolved that from the beginning by presenting that in that way.
Or that right there specifically is an argument for having possibly a physical representation, phys rep, having characters on a map and stuff like that, where you've got the world represented on this grid or whatever you might have.
Yeah, I would say that is a good argument for it. I rarely phys rep.
Same
rarely,
here.
But I've done it before. I mentioned Grimm in another podcast with 7 players. It became essential that I phys rep. With 7 players. So there are reasons to do it.
But not to get too distracted on that. I think that because we sort of put ourselves in this weird space where there's this intersection, if you will, between the imagined world that we're playing in and the real world, and even beyond kind of how the real world informs the way that we think as people. Also just like the etiquette and group dynamics of playing this game, like how we all interact with each other as players, both like, in the context of the game and outside the context of the game, and whatever the superego would be in the world of the game itself, if that makes sense. So if
you mean for the character?
Yes, for the character.
Okay.
So if we're just talking outside of role playing, we're just talking about ourselves and our psyche and how our superego is kind of informed by society and history and all this other stuff, kind of the expectations that we sort of carry into our thought process. our character implicitly has that same thing, whether we think about it or not.
Okay, so I'm immediately brought back into our Camp Lucky Strike season 3 for Roll With It, which I think we could pretty easily say all of us were operating a little bit outside of our own comfort zone, not as characters, but as players. In other words, the morality of the characters themselves was definitely outside of what we ourselves as players would do. Maybe Will Parsons accepted because he was playing the very moral character in that one, and we were lying to him, and we basically faked him out in order to get him to come. And I think even we did a prequel to that as well. It was a kind of play test that became more than that, and we may release that as an unplugged. But I think that a lot of it, for example, the 1940s setting there, issues of racism came up, issues of phobias, and other kinds of biases, and we played that in that world. And I think it would be easy for someone, since we recorded it, for an audience member to overlook and maybe even misunderstand that we, the players, were
reflecting our own viewpoints.
Yeah, we were entrenched in that storytelling, and we ourselves were offended by what our own characters were doing, even as we ourselves were role-playing those characters offensively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I think that's where you kind of get into comparing a little bit to the writer, where a writer might write something knowing that like this is a bad thing the character's doing, and this is like and sometimes you can portray things in a way that makes it very clear that the writer doesn't condone this.
Right.
And other times some people might assume that the writer does condone it. And that gets into some really like deep waters potentially as far as like discussing all that and perception and censorship and whatever else. And I think that leads really nicely into the idea that the player is the ego. Because on the one hand, the player is the psyche of the character. I am the one making all the decisions for my character.
That's true.
To what extent is that separate from my own ego, if we want to talk about it that way? And to what extent am I bringing in the character's id and my id, and to what degree do those differ, if they differ? To what degree am I considering the player's superego and my superego, and whether those differ?
Yeah.
And so ultimately I am acting as the player's ego, but there's also my own ego to contend with, if this makes sense.
I understand your argument fully. Now, I would push back with this very, I think, simple argument. And it's that, I talked last episode about role play being wish fulfillment. And you came back with the idea of sort of a male fantasy theater kind of
like the darker side of the wish fulfillment idea.
But we have to acknowledge that some people do play that way, and we did. Whether it be the Conan character, the fun-loving hacking barbarian who wants the lamentations of the women, or however that goes.
I think back to the Gamers 2 Darkness Rising, which we referred to a couple of times in the podcast. The very fireball happy mage character who brings in so many kind of just like gamer-ish ways of thinking, if you want to put it that way, and totally ignoring what might be even believable, like whether or not it's believable in this world, let alone like good character, if that makes sense.
The sexual politics in that movie are very interesting, especially whenever it's contrasted, because that's a male playing a female character. And then there is a female gamer who's a part of the party, and she is in so many ways more mature than the other two man children who are playing, three really. But setting all that aside for a minute, where I was going with that is simply this. Is there not an argument to be made that the character is actually more like the id of the player who is playing, in that you can be base and you can engage in the lizard brain mentality, and you can perform terrible acts, and you can do all this without consequences in your real world.
Right. Yeah.
is that tantamount to weird fantasy theater? You know what I mean?
Great question. I'll basically just leave it at that. Honestly,
that's my counter argument.
No, and I think that's in a sense where I was going with it too, where because you are the ego for your character, does your real world ego sort of acknowledge that because this isn't the real world, I can take some more liberties? And in a sense, what does that say about you?
Sure. Yeah.
And another way, I think too, people can they can separate the real world from fantasy, right? And so I just think it's an interesting kind of idea to explore.
Sure. Well, we have a mutual friend who has said, and I quote, "I know everything I need to know about a person after spending an afternoon gaming with them."
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about board games, but I think he was also talking about role play, and he also is a LARPer. So he runs the gamut. And that individual basically was saying, listen, throw a war game down and declare an alliance with me. And if at the end of the game that alliance has held, I know more about you. If instead you have betrayed me because it's, quote, just a game, right? Then, and I'll put words into his mouth at this point, I know your true id. You see what I mean? Where the argument that I'm making here is, if you use role play as an opportunity to be promiscuous or murderous or thieverous, that's not a word. It's entirely possible that the wish fulfillment that you are going for there is the type of thing that, given a different circumstance in your life, a different, let's call it, ego construct upon which your life has been built, a different socioeconomic status, or a different country of origin, or a different political indoctrination, take what you will, that it's entirely possible your life could have gone in a different direction. Or is that simply saying, no, we're removing the safeties? This and this, because there is no ego to govern a fictional character. It's fiction, guys. It's fiction. We're playing a game. It is ultimately a game. Does your lizard brain, does your id really know the difference? Is it therapeutic? Is it helpful? Is it harmful? We're not going to answer those questions today, but I'm throwing them out there.
Yeah, and I think that to sort of answer it with a non-answer is to say that it really does depend on the individual and depends on how they're approaching it, what they're trying to get out of the game, how they're interpreting all this. Because I could also say that going in both directions, perhaps being more virtuous than you might be or being less virtuous than you might be, games can be a great exercise, and especially role-playing games can be a great exercise in empathy. And what I mean by that is sort of putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. And so I'm seeing what it feels like, for example, or kind of like what my thought process is, and maybe not in a realistic way, but in a safe sort of thought experiment sort of way, that like, what is it like to be a hateful person? Or what is it like to be a murderous person? Or on the other end, what happens if like I try to make the right decision in this case, either based on like, society standards, or our society standards in real life, or the right decision in this fictional society standards, whatever the case might be, and kind of exploring that and figuring out kind of like what you can learn from it. There have actually been, to kind of go into the realm of video games a little bit, some studies that have talked about exposing players to hyperviolence in a video game. And the part of the experiment, I imagine, was probably implicitly to see like, does violence have an effect on us? And what they found is that most of the time, probably, I think like the vast majority of the time, but I can't say for sure without looking at the actual study, the finding tended to be that people were more repulsed by the idea of violence because they sort of experienced this hyperviolence and the effect that it had on them. They weren't like desensitized to it. In fact, they were more aware and probably would be more responsible with the prospect of violence now because they sort of experienced that, if that makes sense. And so I think
in small doses, I would say that's probably true. In large doses, say for example, a war zone, I think that it might shift or it might not. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. Not that kind of doctor.
Yeah. And so I think that in a way it is going to kind of come down again to the individual and whether or not they're sort of like consciously just indulging in something or whether they are trying to like very carefully kind of, I'm going to see what this is like, with the understanding that it is fiction and that, I have my own sense of morality or ethics or whatever else. And, sometimes it really is just kind of about, I'm trying to tell a story and this is the character I'm trying to portray and the character would do this in this moment. Yeah. And I think too that, interestingly enough, around the table, people will have a tendency to say, out of character, I think this is terrible or something like that. Yeah. Or, we talked before on our podcast about the idea of the X card and putting safeties in place for people who might have issues with certain content in a game for whatever reason.
Sure.
And being able to say, let's not do this in this game right now. And that's totally fair game. And so I think that, if people sort of set the expectation and they know what it is they're trying to get out of role-playing games and what they're not trying to get out of role-playing games, you can kind of have a healthy approach to that. But kind of going back to the idea of the player as ego, kind of the bleed, so to speak, which is a totally different thing. We've heard people talk about the idea of like the game bleeding a little bit too much into real life and vice versa. That can be problematic for them. But, the fact that our own psyche kind of melds in a way with this character's psyche, and to what degree can we or should we separate that, I think is an interesting thing to think about.
Sure.
I'm reminded just a little bit, we've talked before with some people about, I think the term is exomemories, the idea that you can have memories of an experience that you didn't actually experience. People have used it for role-playing games before.
Yes.
I remember when we slayed that dragon, in Dungeons and Dragons.
You never did that.
Yeah, you never did that. Anyway. And yet you, in a way, understanding that you didn't actually, but in a way you kind of feel like you did.
Well, in a neurochemical sense, your brain doesn't know the difference. You may not have had the visual input, but you certainly had other kinds of input. And your imagination can take over in that moment. And the truth is, all of the emotions can be very real, especially if you're deeply invested into a character after years and years and years of play session. I know that the longest campaigns that I have run have been, in many ways, if not the best stories I've ever told, at least the most emotionally impactful stories I've told, if that makes any sense. And I think that that's the true secret to understanding Dungeons and Dragons is you play 3 or 4 sessions, you're just not going to get to that level. You play for 4 years, guess what? You're very forgiving of the system. You've got the whole thing memorized and. So to buttress this from the other side, I would say simply this. We're talking about a psychological principle and asking whether or not it can be used as a model to help us to understand some of the things that we might or might not do in role play. I would look at it from the other side too and say this. Role play is something that is used in a clinical psychology setting, and it is used to great success. I personally, although I'm not that kind of doctor, have used it within a teaching environment, not just on the college level, but also on what we think of as a high school level. There was a time whenever my family owned a school, and it was a K through 12 school, and I would invite particular individuals, especially those on the spectrum, to sit down at the table. And one of my favorite moments was when one of our students decided to kick down a door, go upstairs, and heal the woman who had said, or the daughter of the woman who said, "Do not come into my house. Whatever you do, I know you. You're a witch." And the next scene, then he was being chased out of town with pitchforks and torches, and up a tree. And he said, "Whoa, stop! What just happened?" And it was this wonderful moment where we, as a table, were able to analyze what did just happen. Why do you think that? And we thought it through, and everybody kind of came at it. And these are, these were students who were diagnosed with having empathy problems as a part of their diagnosis. And that's not me being mean. That's me understanding their educational needs. And because of that, we were able to do this week after week after week. And those individuals developed a greater, broader understanding through role play. And I know that, like I said, that's used in a clinical setting, even to greater effect of, talk to the pillow to reference
very intentional use of these techniques. Yeah.
I think that there is a lot to be said. Maybe, maybe Freud isn't the right model. Maybe we can talk about the Jungian model in some future episode. I don't know, or some other something. But if the broad blanket statement is, can we do things in role play that we can't do otherwise, and does it help us explore those things? I think that it must be a unilateral, universal, resounding, oh yes, we can do so much more in so many different ways with our characters than we can with ourselves as players. And those characters can enrich our lives.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing with, the reasons we enjoy fiction.
Certainly.
And getting invested in these fictional characters. I mean, really, like you said about the neurochemical kind of reaction, I think I'm probably going to be butchering this quote to paraphrase something that I heard on a podcast about writing. And I think that they were paraphrasing someone. So it's kind of like a telephone game with this paraphrase. But basically, writing or reading or whatever else is tweaking a survival instinct for jollies.
Oh, nice.
Kind of like we're making our brain have a reaction to a fear, for example, that's not real, or to a joy that's not real, or something like that. And, even if you don't want to go into like kind of the sort of biological, the biochemical sort of aspect of it, simply that we can enjoy, and like for a little while, we can sort of put ourselves in this other world and come away with meaning from it, despite the fact that it's not real. And if we approach it in a sort of, what's the word I'm trying to look for here? Like a reasonable way, a rational way, and we understand what is real and what's not, and what that means for what is real, then it can be something that's very powerful and very healthy as well.
I think you're talking about the willing suspension of disbelief.
A part of it, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what more could I say than that?
And so thank you for joining us, everyone, for this very interesting conversation on the idea of player as ego. And of course, this is not meant necessarily to make any sort of definitive statement about anything. Even this model might be deeply flawed. But I just thought it'd be something fun to talk about. So we hope you enjoyed it as well. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.